He sent the photo to colleagues in Preston, Manchester, and even London. At the station, he put the photo on the wall. Instead of trying to find a stolen painting, he began to feel that he was trying to find the beautiful woman. It seemed very important to take her back to the gallery where she lived. After a few days, the other police officers started to joke about Michael's painting. He looked at it 100 times a day. Sometimes, when he was talking to someone, his eyes would go to the photograph. "Have you fallen in love?" some of the officers asked. Michael no longer chattered with the villagers. He didn't seem to have time anymore. Even Harriet the cat seemed in a bad mood because of summer. Michael only wanted to hunt for the painting and was no longer interested in playing with her. Whenever he had a moment, he was on the phone or visiting auction houses, asking about the painting. Even when he was not at work, he'd visit places that sold old paintings. On Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was exactly 5 days since summer had been stolen. Every time the phone rang, Michael hoped it was about the painting. It was Joan Potts from the gallery. "Something terrible has happened," she exclaimed. "Lottie has been taken to hospital. Another painting was stolen, and this time the thief pushed Lottie down the stairs. She's unconscious." After going straight to the gallery and looking at the crime scene, Michael went to the hospital with Joan. They were both very worried about Lottie. Because she was old, her chances of getting better quickly were not good. She'd hit her head quite badly and broken one of her legs. Joan couldn't help crying as they stood in the waiting room at the hospital. The doctor in charge promised to call Michael as soon as there was a change. Michael needed to ask her about what happened. Perhaps Lottie saw the thief coming up the stairs. But while she was unconscious and in danger, all he could do was wait and hope. Meanwhile, he needed to contact the Art Loss Register about the second stolen painting. It was another Butterworth, called Evening in June. This time it was of a terrace outside a lovely old house. There was a table with teacups and a teapot, and a large strawberry cake. On one of the chairs sat a woman. Michael recognized her as the woman from summer. This time she was dressed in a pretty purple dress. She was reading a book. In the background were green hills, and the sun was just going down. The sunset seemed to make the picture glow. Michael thought it was strange that both paintings were of the same woman. There were many Butterworth pictures that showed landscapes or still life scenes. Only a few had the young woman in them. Perhaps that was a clue. "Who was she?" Michael asked when he called Joan that night. "Don't you know?" asked Joan. "It's Sylvia. Sylvia and Tristan Butterworth got married in 1950. She was very beautiful, and was his model for some of his paintings. Maybe, if we find out more about Sylvia Butterworth, it might give us a clue, Michael said. Perhaps the thief wants to collect paintings of her. Good idea, said Joan. Maybe he's obsessed with her. We have an archive at the gallery. It has a lot of information about Sylvia in it. You can look at it if you like. The next day, after his afternoon shift, Michael went back to the Oswald Gallery. It had been closed, and there were plans to buy security cameras. The risk of someone getting hurt again was too big. Joan took Michael upstairs to a small office. It was filled with filing cabinets. "This is the Butterworth archive," Joan said. "The filing cabinets are full of photographs and letters. They belong to both Tristan and Sylvia. There are also lots of papers about Butterworth's paintings and exhibitions. You can look through them if you like." Joan made him a cup of coffee. Then she gave him the keys to the gallery and the code number of the alarm system. She went back to the hospital, where she spent her evenings sitting with Lottie. Michael was alone. He didn't know where to start looking. All he knew was that someone had a reason for stealing Butterworth's paintings of Sylvia. Perhaps the past would give him a clue. First, he pulled open some files of photographs. There were lots of black and white ones. There were many of Sylvia by herself. Michael knew they were not important for the investigation, but he couldn't help looking. Some were of Sylvia when she was very young. Most showed her in her 20s and 30s. Michael felt that he had never seen anyone more beautiful. Sylvia had big, dark eyes and a glowing smile. She was quite tall and looked strong and confident. When she was younger, she had worn her long hair down. When she was older, she wore it up, in the style of the 1950s. Her clothes were always pretty and looked good on her. In some of the photos, she was with a man. Michael recognized him as Tristan Butterworth. The names, places, and dates were written on the backs of many photos. There were many pictures, for example, of Tristan and Sylvia in a gorgeous landscape. In the background were lakes and mountains. On the backs of the pictures were the words Honeymoon, Cumbria, 1950. The couple looked very happy. Some of the photographs showed other people too. There were many that had been taken on the terrace of a house. Michael thought it was the same terrace as in Evening in June. In the photos, lots of people were standing around. They had glasses of wine and cigarettes. In other photos, the same people were sitting under a tree, having a picnic. Behind them, the Pendley River flowed. Everyone was smiling at the camera. There were a few pictures of Butterworth with another man. The pictures said Nigel and Tristan, with different places and dates. There were also pictures of Nigel and Sylvia. Next, he looked at some old letters. There were lots from Sylvia to Tristan. Michael began to read. He read for a long time. When he looked at his watch, He had been reading for over an hour. He had been in a different world. It seemed as though Sylvia was writing to him. He put down the letters and picked up some different ones. All of them were to Sylvia from a man named Nigel Huxley. Some were dated from 1941 to 1944 and had been sent from France. Michael looked through them quickly. Huxley had written about being a soldier in World War II. He wrote about being frightened when bombs fell close by. He also told her about other soldiers who had died. Some of the letters were very serious, but others were full of fun. In these light letters, he wrote about parties and friends. Huxley had written, "To my darling Sylvia," at the top of the letters. It was clear that he had been in love with her. Michael took out his notebook and wrote down Nigel's name. Perhaps he was still alive. Maybe he had more information about Sylvia and the paintings. Michael had been in the archive for hours. At last he decided to go home. He wanted to come back as soon as possible, because there were many more letters and papers to look at. But before he left, Michael opened the filing cabinet with the photos. There was one he wanted to see again. The photo showed Sylvia sitting on a beach. She was wearing a big sun hat and a white dress. Her hair was down. In her hands was a small book. She had stopped reading and was looking into the camera. But instead of smiling, Sylvia looked serious. Michael felt that she was looking right at him. Before he could stop himself, he had picked up the photo. Then he put it into his pocket. He had never stolen anything in his life. Now he was a thief, just like the person who had taken the paintings. Michael had spent many hours in the archive, and it was now night time. On his way home, he drove past the cemetery. He was worried that the teenagers were there again. Suddenly, he saw something. It looked like the glow from a candle or a torch. It seemed to be moving among the graves. "Those kids," Michael said out loud. He looked at his watch. 12:16 a.m. Michael stopped the car at the gates and got out his torch. Then he went into the cemetery. The light seemed to have disappeared. He listened, but he couldn't hear anything. The moon was shining brightly, and the air smelled like cut grass and old flowers. He walked on. The graves looked quite scary in the dark. Although he didn't believe in ghosts, Michael didn't feel very brave. It was like a graveyard scene from a scary movie. Suddenly, he got angry. The teenagers were probably hiding from him. Maybe Alex and his friends were all sitting behind the headstones, waiting for him to go away. They probably thought this was funny. Michael decided to switch off his torch and wait for the kids to come out. The moonlight helped him to see quite well. But suddenly a cloud moved across the sky, and the moonlight disappeared. It was very dark. Michael turned around in a circle. Nothing. No light. And he still couldn't hear anything either. He was about to switch his torch back on when he saw a small light. It was near the old caretaker's house. There was someone there. Michael put on his torch again. He shone it across the graves towards the empty old house. "Hello?" he called out. Immediately the candlelight disappeared. Michael started to walk. "It's Sergeant Rose here," he shouted. "What are you doing?" When he reached the house, he shone his torch all around. There was nobody there. However, a strange symbol had appeared on the front door. It showed 3 stars inside a circle, painted in yellow paint. He tried the door, but it wouldn't open. He went up to some of the windows and shone his torch inside. The rooms were empty, apart from some broken tables and chairs. There were spiders' webs everywhere. "Whoever you are," Michael said to the empty air, "you should go home." Suddenly he heard a ghostly laugh. He couldn't tell if it was a man's or a woman's voice. Before he could turn around, there was a sharp pain in his head, and he was falling towards the ground. Chapter 3. Young Woman with Flowers. When Michael finally opened his eyes, his clothes were wet from lying in the grass for a long time. He put his hand to his head. When he looked at his hand, there was something dark on his fingers. Blood. He felt sick, and his head hurt. His torch was lying on the ground, but it wasn't working anymore. Michael looked around. He didn't know what to do. The best thing would be to call his boss, then go to the hospital and get a doctor to look at him. He stood up. All he wanted to do was get into bed. Slowly he went back to his car and drove home. Early the next morning, Michael went to the station. He wrote a report about what happened in the graveyard. His head still hurt badly, but he didn't want to spend the day waiting to see a doctor. Instead, he called the hospital about Lottie. She was still unconscious, and the doctors were doing all sorts of tests. After the hospital call, he phoned the homes of Alex and some of the other teenagers from the cemetery. He asked their parents to bring them down to the station as soon as possible. If Alex had hit Michael, he was in serious trouble. Then he arranged for another officer to talk to the teenagers. Although Michael wanted to talk to Alex and the others himself, he was a witness to a crime. He couldn't be the questioning officer too. Then Michael searched the internet for Nigel Huxley. Huxley might have information about the paintings or Sylvia. He found out that Huxley had also been an artist. He was a sculptor, but he was not as famous as Butterworth. His last sculpture was made in 1967. Now Huxley lived in the village, only 20 kilometres from Pendle Lee. He was 85 years old, and it seemed that he was very rich. Michael thought about everything he now knew about Huxley. He lived nearby and knew about art. And although he was old, you didn't have to be fit to push an old lady downstairs. He had been in love with Sylvia. Perhaps he had driven to the gallery. He could have stolen Summer while Lottie was looking at the new paintings upstairs. The second time, Lottie may have seen him stealing Evening in June. He might have pushed her down the stairs, then put the painting in the car and driven home. Michael decided to pay Huxley a visit. But first he put out some cat food for Harriet. The big tabby was still in a bad mood. Michael just wanted to talk about, think about, and dream about those paintings. He had no time for cats or the other villagers. When Mr. Murphy came in that morning with a bag of aubergines, Michael had simply thanked him and looked back at the computer. At lunchtime, Michael drove to the nearby village. It took him a long time to find Huxley's house. The house was very large. In fact, it was a mansion, but it was hidden behind lots of trees on the edge of the village. Michael parked the police car in front of the house. It was a lovely old place. There were lots of steps leading to a big door. Michael went up and rang the bell. After a few moments, an elderly woman opened the door. "Mrs. Huxley?" Michael asked. "No, I'm the housekeeper," the woman said. She looked at his police uniform and car. For some reason, she didn't seem too happy. "Do you want to see Mr. Huxley?" "Yes, please, if he's at home," Michael replied. "You'd better come in," said the housekeeper. Michael followed her into the house. "Wait here." The housekeeper pointed to a chair by the door. She wasn't friendly at all. Michael wondered if she ever smiled. He sat down. The big hall was painted a light green. The floor was made of gorgeous dark wood. In the corner stood a large sculpture. Michael couldn't really tell what it was. It could have been a woman with long wavy hair, or a tree. Whatever it was, it looked very modern. Suddenly the housekeeper appeared again. "You can see Mr. Huxley now," she said. "He's in the living room." Nigel Huxley sat in a big chair. He didn't look 85 at all. He seemed a lot younger. But perhaps that was because of his bright blue eyes. He looked intelligent and full of energy. "I'm sorry about my housekeeper," Huxley said. "She's not very nice to visitors, even policemen." Michael looked around the living room. The sun was shining through the large windows. There were 2 huge sofas and a few chairs. In the middle of the room was a round table. Lots of books were everywhere, on the table, on bookshelves, and on the floor. There was also a beautiful old fireplace. Above the fireplace, on the wall, there was a painting. Michael immediately recognized Sylvia. "That's a Butterworth picture," he exclaimed. "Yes," Huxley said. "It's called Young Woman with Flowers. Tristan Butterworth gave it to me." The painting showed Sylvia holding lots of flowers. They were pink, orange and red. The background was a dark green, and Sylvia was wearing a green dress. Michael couldn't take his eyes off the picture. Even when the housekeeper came in with tea and biscuits, he couldn't stop looking at Sylvia. "How can I help you?" Huxley asked, taking a cup of tea and a chocolate biscuit. Michael finally took his eyes off the painting and looked at the old man. "I'm sorry, Mr. Huxley. I should have introduced myself. I'm Sergeant Rose, from the police station at Pendle Lee. You heard about the robbery at the gallery?" asked Michael. "Of course," Huxley replied. "I collect Butterworth paintings. I'm often at the Oswald Gallery." "You know that Lottie Bingley is unconscious in hospital?" Michael asked, watching Huxley closely. "Yes, it's very sad and upsetting," Huxley said. Michael looked at the picture of Sylvia above the fireplace. "Somebody wanted those pictures very badly," he said. "Badly enough to almost kill an elderly woman. Both paintings were of Sylvia. I think we should look for someone who is obsessed with her." Huxley's eyes shone, and he gave a small smile. "So you've come to question me," he said. "Good detective work, Sergeant Rose. It's true. I was in love with Sylvia. She and I grew up together. Our families were friends. We lived in the same village and went to the same church. Even when I was a teenager, I loved her. I met Tristan Butterworth at art school. Sylvia would model for us both. Then the Second World War started. I became a soldier. But Tristan couldn't join the army. He had polio when he was a baby, and there was something wrong with his leg. While I was in France, Tristan and Sylvia fell in love. I wanted them to be happy, so we stayed friends." "What happened to Tristan and Sylvia?" Michael asked. He'd almost forgotten about the stolen art. "The Butterworths moved to America in the 1960s, Huxley went on. "We wrote letters at Christmas, but after a few years, our letters stopped. I heard they were living in New York. Tristan had an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. Then I read in the paper that he had died in 1986,